Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie Van Zant, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the April Diane Rehm Book Club. It's a special one today, as it is Diane's final book club here at the station. We thank Diane for all the wonderful conversations about literature that we've shared since the book club began 5 years ago. And we thank you, our audience, for being a part of this incredible journey. For this final interview, Diane asked one of her favorite authors, Geraldine Brooks, to join her for a discussion of her memoir, Memorial Days. Brooks is a journalist turned Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist known for books like March, Horse, and Year of Wonders. For 35 years, she was married to fellow Pulitzer Prize winner Tony Horwitz, historian and author of Confederates in the Attic and Spying on the South. In 2019, he collapsed on a street in a suburb outside of Washington, D.C., and died. It was sudden, it was tragic, and in an instant, completely transformed the life Brooks had and the future she had imagined. Memorial Days is the story of mourning, but also of love. It is beautiful and heartrending. We are so honored that she's here to talk about it today. Before the conversation starts, a few reminders. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to use closed captioning, please click on the CC button, which is also found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Everything we do at WAMU is made possible by your support. If you enjoyed the discussion today, please consider making a gift online by visiting wamu.org/donate. And now, here's Diane and Geraldine Brooks.
Geraldine Brooks, it's wonderful to see you. And first, let me thank you for getting up in the middle of the night. I know you're in Sydney, Australia, to do this with us. And first, let me say how sorry I am for the loss of your dear husband.
Well, Diane, I know it's an experience that we sadly share. And you had written so beautifully in On My Own about your marriage and loss. And writing this book, I've learned just how many people are carrying the same grief that we have.
I'm sure you have heard from hundreds and hundreds of people who not only knew Tony, but also people who've now read your beautiful book. Give me a sense of what that reaction has been.
Well, of course, there are people who knew Tony who didn't know everything about, nobody knows everything about another person's marriage,
Of
but
course not.
Who've expressed, even some delight at getting to know him a little bit better through the book. And then there's been the outpouring, as you say, from people that we did not know, who've shared this experience, who have reached out to me and told me the book's been helpful to them. And that's been extraordinarily fulfilling to me, because I didn't expect that. And then, I had an experience that really made it all worthwhile, which was a woman who told me that it probably saved her husband's life, because she read the book and sent her husband for the first time for a cardiology workup. And
Wow.
they basically didn't let him leave the cardiologist's office. He went straight to a bypass surgery.
Wow.
He would have made it if he
That's
hadn't.
extraordinary. And that must give you great satisfaction to have saved a life, literally.
It is. It's an extraordinary thing. It's a real
I
gift.
I see your hair blowing. So I know you're in Sydney, Australia. You must be sitting outdoors on a porch.
I am on my porch, and the sun is just starting to come up.
Ah,
and I can see the other side of the water now.
lovely. Tell me how much time you're spending in Australia these days and how much time at Martha's Vineyard.
It's a bit of a work in progress. This year has been wonderful because I've had my youngest son doing a semester abroad in my hometown of Sydney.
Lovely.
And so I've been here since December.
Ah,
I'll be heading back to see my beloved dog and donkey in a couple of weeks.
wonderful. I'm so glad. I learned when I read this beautiful book, Memorial Days, that when you went to Australia after Tony's death, you began, or you had already begun riding horse, but it was so difficult for you to get back into it. How did you manage?
I think took me a year because at first I'm just blindsided by the grief and then all the incredible demands of the death bureaucracy, the nitty gritty of ending a life according to law and all the other things that you have to do. And then I just couldn't think straight. I could not get into the level of concentration that you need to be in when you're creating a world and characters. And I wasn't sure if I was ever going to be able to, but two things happened. One relates to your NPR colleague, Nina Totenberg, who had got a piece of advice from Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was in a difficult period of her life. And she had passed it on to another colleague who's a great friend of mine, Deborah Amos. And Deborah Amos, of course, a remarkable correspondent for NPR. And so, who had also lost her wonderful husband. And she came to see me right after Tony died and said, the advice is do your work.
Mhm.
It might not be your best work, but it will be good work and it will be what saves you. And it took a while for me to believe in the truth of that statement, but in the end I did, and I crawled back to my desk. And I find now, Diane, work is the thing. Work is
Indeed,
what I'm using to fill the empty place.
indeed. And the second thing,
The second thing was that Tony loved the book. It was his period of history. Tony Horwitz is a great scholar of the Civil War and the immediate antebellum period, and we'd actually done some of the research for the book together because the book he was working on, Spying on the South, overlapped unexpectedly with the story of the racehorse Lexington in a
wow,
number of places. So we
wow.
went to Kentucky on a research trip together. So he was very much entwined in the book and he would find things for me. He was a great archive diver and he had found wonderful nuggets of research that I could use. And so I felt like I really wanted to finish this book so I could dedicate it to him.
Oh,
And that was really the motivation to do it.
how wonderful. I must say, the two of you had an extraordinary partnership in addition to an extraordinary marriage. I
We
mean,
did.
some people do and some people don't. And the two of you really had a working as well as a loving partnership.
We did. You know, we were lucky to meet in graduate school. And we didn't faff around, as you say. We got married within about a year of meeting each other. And then we were lucky enough to be able to have a career in parallel. We were both foreign correspondents. We worked in the Middle East and in the Balkans and different countries in Africa, often not together, but in parallel, and sometimes covering conflicts from opposite sides. And we did that for a good decade. And then after our first son was born, I made the transition out of journalism towards fiction, and he made a transition to writing nonfiction. And it's pretty unlikely that two people are going to be able to successfully make that transition to be full-time book writers. And we were the lucky pair who did. So our working life tracked so much that when we were working together at the Wall Street Journal, they just combined our surnames, Horwitz and Brooks, and called us Hobro. And and we actually felt a bit like Hobro. We felt like one person much of the time.
Yes, I can understand that. Tell me about how you learned of Tony's death.
Oh, Diane, it was brutal. I have to preface it by saying, as far as we knew, he was the picture of health. He was a 6 day a week gym rat. He was 60 years old. He didn't have a gram of excess body fat. And he was very vigorous and fun. And he was on book tour, and he loved book tour. He loved connecting with readers and booksellers. And he had crisscrossed the country. And he finally was back in his hometown of Washington, D.C. And it was Memorial Day weekend. And he had no events. So he's able to take a couple of days off. And he was enjoying that at his brother's house. And he
Ah,
went out. He went out for brunch, and he dropped dead literally in the street, just a few blocks from the house in Chevy Chase where he was born. So it
oh
was
my.
quite a remarkable thing for a guy who covered so much of the world in his career uh, to have been born and pronounced dead in the same hospital. But I didn't know. That's our morning chorus of birds. Can you hear
Oh,
that?
how lovely. How lovely.
So I knew nothing about that, and then I was at home in Martha's Vineyard, and it's the Memorial Day is a very busy weekend on the vineyard. Everybody
Of
who has a
course.
summer house comes to open their summer house, and I'd had a lot of pleasant distractions with friends dropping in the morning and talking to my sons, one of whom was about to get on a plane. He was on a post-graduation adventure with his girlfriend, and I had finally opened the file to get to work on my novel, and the phone rang. And I was inclined not to pick it up, but then I thought it might be one of the boys. So I picked it up, and it was a doctor from a hospital in Washington. And she just told me that my husband had collapsed in the street and was dead. And I just couldn't take it in. I could not absorb the news at all. I kept asking her to repeat it, and I didn't know what to do. But she was a young doctor at the end of her very busy shift on a holiday weekend, and she didn't really have time for me. She couldn't get me off the phone fast enough. So there I am, I'm all alone, and I just wanted to collapse and howl, but I didn't allow myself to do that because I had so many other things I had to then do: contact my sons, contact Tony's family, and get myself to Washington, which is no mean feat on Memorial Day weekend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But how
So,
sad that the doctor gave you the news in such a blunt fashion. I understand my daughter herself is a physician. I know how tired they get, but delivering that kind of news, one would have hoped for more.
well, I don't blame her, but I do blame the system. And to the credit of the hospital, they have reached out since the book came out and said, what could we do better? And I said, I have so many ideas.
Uh-huh.
I mean, for me, I was shocked because in movies and on TV, nobody gets that news alone. There's always a knock on the door and somebody asks you to sit down and asked you if you want a glass of water and who can they call. I don't actually think that it's safe to do what they did, because who knows how somebody's going to react to that kind
Exactly.
of news. They could have done some very irrational thing, you know. So I told them, you know, in my case, it would have been excellent if they had have called the local police, because first responders are trained to deal with people in trauma. And in our small community, I know those guys. They are the coaches for my kids' football teams and lacrosse teams, and they would have known who to bring, you know. But if not that, at least have somebody at the hospital who is trained and who has
Exactly.
time and who can
Exactly.
give you all the information as many times as you need to hear it, and make sure you're safe before they hang up.
Had Tony shown any signs of illness?
In hindsight, yes. He said that when he was, it was pretty funny actually. We were coming back from Passover in DC, and he was taking the train to New York, and I was going home with the boys, and we were in a cab, and he realized that we were stuck in traffic. So he jumped out with his wheelie bag and he was carrying it over his head through the traffic, running for the train. And he said he was short of breath. And I thought, well, anybody would be short of breath after that. So, but then it happened after a tennis game. And he said, to the extent that I work out so much, I shouldn't be getting short of breath. So he did go and see his doctor, and they were planning a workup. You know, there was nothing obviously wrong. The doctor gave him a cursory exam, and there was nothing obviously wrong. And Tony said, well, I can't get all those tests done before I go on book tour. And
Oh,
so they made an appointment to do it after book tour.
oh, I see.
And that was too late. And it was, we found out later he had myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the myocardium of the heart. And people have that, and about a third of them recover with no symptoms, and it's only discovered post-mortem. A third of people have it and get progressively sicker and need all kinds of interventions up to and including a heart transplant. And the other third, like Tony, uh, one day the scar tissue from the inflammation interrupts the electrical signals to the heart, and they die suddenly. And that's what happened to him.
It's really extraordinary the amount of exercise you write that he was doing to keep himself in such good shape.
He enjoyed it too, because he was a very A-type personality, and he ran on a high temperature and at a high energy, and he loved those gym trips. So he would write, and then he'd go to the gym, and to get himself agitated, he'd watch Fox News, and I'm sure that wasn't very good for his heart.
In these days, and for Tony, I can certainly understand that. But the shock, therefore, had to be that much greater for you to have this doctor on the phone saying your husband has died when what you saw was a man who was in good shape, who was diligent about his exercise. But was there anything about which you were concerned?
No, not with regards to his health. He was, he was younger than I, and in better shape than I was. So, if you ever asked yourself that question, my answer was always, I'll go first, because I'd had a run-in with cancer in my
I
40s, and,
remember.
we wasn't like we hadn't looked at mortality at all. But I think the suddenness was, leaves you so unprepared. I know, Diane, you had a horribly long time to prepare for your loss, and in fact too long, as you write so beautifully in the book, that your beloved husband wanted an easier death than our society allows people. But I think when you don't have that preparation, it's a mess. frankly, because 35 years of marriage, you get into a division of labor, and there were things that he took care of that I hadn't had to bother my pretty head about for 35 years, including how do you file a tax return. I didn't know he loved investing for our retirement, and it was a hobby for him to follow the markets, but I had no idea what he was doing. I didn't know how he did it, how he made those decisions, and then I had to be on a very steep learning curve so that I didn't let everything fall apart for our sons.
Geraldine, would you read for us from the middle of page 8 to the end of the first paragraph on page 9? Do you feel up to doing that? I know it's only a little after 4 in the morning for you.
No, that's fine. So you want from when I get to Flinders Island?
Tony died on Memorial Day.
Tony died on Memorial Day, the American holiday that falls on the last Monday in May and honors the war dead. When I get to Flinders Island, I will begin my own Memorial Days. I am taking something that our culture has stopped freely giving, the right to grieve, to shut out the world and its demands, to remember my love, and to feel the immensity of his loss. Grief is praise, writes Martin Pretschell in his book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, because it is the natural way love honors what it misses. I haven't honored Tony enough because I have not permitted myself the time and space for a grief deep enough to reflect our love. This will be finally the time when I will not have to prepare a face for the faces that I meet. The place where I will not have to pretend that things are normal and that I am okay. Because it has been more than 3 years, and contrary to appearances, I am not at all okay. I have come to realize that my life since Tony's death has been one endless, exhausting performance. I've cast myself in a role, woman being normal. I've moved around in public, acting out a series of convincing scenes. PTO mom, conservation commissioner, author on tour. But nothing has been normal. Here, finally, the long-running show goes on hiatus.
Geraldine, what has it felt like for you to be able to shed that pretense that I am normal?
So I took myself off to the remotest place I could think of, which was the far end of an island in the Bass Strait, which is the waterway between Australia and the island of Tasmania. And it's a very beautiful island, and I was completely alone there, and I was able to take myself back psychologically to the moment in my study where I had pushed down the natural reaction to Tony's death because I couldn't afford to let myself fall apart at that time. And I arrived on that island. I think of them now as a whole series of garbage bags that I carried with me, and gradually I set them down one by one. And the most important thing I learned from doing that work was that I needed to set down above all the bag that contained the life that I had fully expected to have, with Tony at my side and the work we would do still to come. And then when our work was not the most important thing, all the wonderful adventures that we would have together until we were just sitting on a porch watching sunsets. That was my expectation of how it would go. And I realized that life was gone. It was not coming back. And I just had to accept that and set that aside and embrace the life that I do have. and resolve to make it as vivid and meaningful as I can. And so I think that was making that decision was the biggest part of being able to let go of the act and just be myself, this new version of myself.
But first, you had to get through Tony's memorial service. Tell us about that on Martha's Vineyard.
So one of the things that happens after a loss is you have to make a lot of decisions at a time when you're not really in any state to make a decision. And I had made a very bad decision about the date of the memorial service. And it actually picked the busiest week on Martha's Vineyard. So then it was a case of how are we going to get everybody here and where are we going to put them? And, you know, lovely friends stepped up and offered guest houses and couches. And I got grace beyond expectation of what people did to make it work. And then it's kind of, I think of it now as a kind of joyless wedding because it's a lot of people and you have to feed and house them and there's a ceremony. But you have no idea who's going to show up. You don't have RSVPs for a memorial service. So I was dreading it and I was doing all the busy work. And then we're in this, I had chosen a building that Tony loved. It's a historic whaling church that is now a beautiful gathering space with gigantic light flooded windows and white clapboard, real New England classic building. And the people who spoke were close friends, and writers' friends tend to be writers. So the eulogies were really wonderful and full of reminiscences of Tony's character and his humor. And it was just a delight. And my younger son was the MC, and my older son spoke absolutely beautifully about the strands of hope that he had clung on to weave a rope to bring him to acceptance of losing his dad and his best friend. And one of the things that he clung to was the manner of Tony's death, that he didn't see it coming. You know, he would have been a very poor invalid. We all, my sons and I both think he wouldn't have wanted to be a diminished and sick man, and he didn't have to be.
I understand.
And also the consolation that we have in that he's still with us in his books. And the boys and I often pull a book off the shelf and read our favorite bits, particularly the funny bits. And it does feel like he's back with us for a moment.
The memorial service makes me think of how much you and Tony loved to entertain, that there were always people on the island, and you'd be the one in the kitchen doing the work. He'd be the one entertaining people because that's what he enjoyed doing. You, the shyer person, if I might use that word, and the more perhaps private person.
Not even private, but he was a true extrovert.
Yes.
Much to a much. I've become less shy as I've got older, and you know, I do enjoy now, you know, being in front of an audience and talking about books. And at first in my career, that was very hard for me, but he's just a natural extrovert and he loves people and all kinds of people. Honestly, Diane, one of my great regrets about his loss is that he was uniquely qualified to cover the moment that we find ourselves in. When I watched the mob storming the Capitol, I thought, I bet Tony has had a beer with 20% of those guys. because he was fascinated by why people think the way they do. And he would run towards people that most of us run away from. You know, he never, there were no deplorables as far as Tony was concerned. People might have deplorable views, in his opinion, but the people themselves were just an endless source of fascination to him. What in their life had led them to the place that they were in, and how could he understand it, and how could we better understand each other? That was really his life's work.
And therefore, to be without him at gatherings, even in your own home, something is truly missing.
Yeah, it's not the same. It never will be. But my sons each have aspects of his personality, and they've stepped up in amazing ways. I can see him in both of them. My younger one is a natural host, and he's got a wicked sense of humor. My older one has the kind of this exactly the same intellectual passions and curiosities. So he lives.
You know, as I was reading the book for the second time, I still could not believe that you chose a shack with an outhouse. You must tell me and the people watching why you chose such a small space to be in, one that didn't even have an indoor bathroom.
You know, it doesn't matter because Flinders Island is just so beautiful. You're there for nature, really. That was what I was looking for, because I find nature incredibly restorative, and I was looking for that kind of healing that you can get from being in a wild and beautiful place. And to be honest, Diane, that's all there is there. There's no fancy hotels on Flinders Island. If you're going to go there, you're going there for nature, to be in nature. And it's great to sort of pare down life, you know, to some necessities. And that outhouse had the most spectacular view of water and mountains that you could imagine. So I did not feel the lack of creature comforts at all. I mean, my routine was to get up and write every morning, just to try and get back to understand what had happened to me. And I think writers understand best by writing. And then when I was, you know, cramped and crotchety from sitting too long, I would go for a long bushwalk or a long ocean swim. And there was just an incredible serenity to being in a place where there's absolutely nobody else. My companions were a little minion of wallabies who would come in the evening, and I'd give them a lettuce leaf, and they would just be in a circle on the grass in front of the shack.
Oh my gosh. And is it still that way in your present lodging?
No, I'm in a lovely, a lovely community in Sydney. There's a lot of nature here, but if you want people, there's a great bookstore that has music and gatherings every Friday night, and you never know who's going to turn up, and everybody sits at long tables and has a glass of wine and talks about books or politics or whatever. So yes, I'm not in solitude anymore.
And are you surrounded primarily by Australians, or is there a community of Americans there?
No, it's you know, here when I'm in Sydney, I'm with my sister and with some of my very oldest friends, people that I even went to elementary school
Oh
with,
my goodness, how
people
wonderful.
that I started journalism with as a young cub reporter. And you know, we're all getting older, as you do. But it is wonderful to be able to catch up, as you know, all the people who knew you when you were very young. It's an invaluable kind of friendship. And I have a lovely posse of friends on the Vineyard, particularly women friends. But they're the friends that I made when I was a fully formed, fully baked human
I
being.
understand. Tell me about the form that the book takes. You do alternating chapters on Tony's life, your life with him, and then your time alone in Australia.
Yeah, so it fell into that structure just naturally. I wasn't writing this. It's not like my other books that I write very much with enthusiasm for my readers and thinking about readers as I'm writing it. I'm sorry to admit, readers, I wasn't thinking about you. It was something I was doing for myself. And it turns out that what I was doing in returning to the moment and trying to remember every detail of what had happened is a therapeutic practice that's recommended for PTSD sufferers, that you go back and relive the traumatic event, adding more and more detail as much as you can remember. And so that was what I was doing. And I would do that in the morning. And then I would go off and be in nature and try and notice. Ever since I was in my early 20s and I read Annie Dillard's wonderful book, A Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is a masterpiece of ferocious noticing. I've tried to do that when I'm in nature. And so my afternoons would be spent just taking in the beauties of the island and what it had to offer, the wildlife and the trees and the rocks and the ocean, and coming back and writing that down. And so it just fell into a natural structure of alternating between the events of 3 years earlier and what I was seeing day to day on the island.
How hard was it for you to write of your memories with Tony?
It was actually great. I felt like I was spending the time with him. He was a journal keeper for much of his life, I think, until he started being a full-time book writer. He kept very detailed journals, and I had never read them. They were his private space for his thoughts. And but I took some with me to Flinders Island, and I learned new things about him, which I thought his death had deprived me of. I didn't think I'd be able to learn any new things about him, but it was fun to revisit our courtship and our early lives in journalism, because you look back and you don't remember what it was like to be you. So it was great to have his view of how things went.
Is there a surprise in those journals that you can share with us?
Well, one thing that actually made me laugh out loud all alone on my deck in front of the shack was, I think it must have been 1989, and Tony had not yet been hired by the Wall Street Journal, and we were in the Middle East, and he was working as a stringer, which is a very thankless way to do journalism. You work for various papers, and you're never sure where your next assignment is coming from. And he writes a line, I've had to come to accept that I might never amount to anything in journalism. And I just laughed out loud, because not a year or two later, he was getting the Pulitzer Prize for national.
Exactly.
So we never know what life is bringing us. And, later that day, as I was reflecting on that, I thought, well, for better and for worse, because he didn't know how successful he would be in journalism. And I was sorry that he had those uncertainties, but also he didn't know that his life was going to come to a sudden stop on a street in Chevy Chase either, and that was a good thing that he didn't know that was coming, and he was just a successful author about to be on the bestseller list again, and enjoying a successful book tour.
How wonderful. There was a question that came to us asking how one accepts the grief that is so deep and finally manages not to get through it or get over it, but to deal with it.
I think it's a realization that the grief and the joy can exist side by side, and that we had so much more than many people have, 35 years of happy marriage, to embrace the gratitude for that. And then, you know, it opens your heart to other people's losses and other people's struggles. I think it makes you a more compassionate person. So for everything that you lose, there are some compensations that not compensations, but there's grace, I suppose. I can't think of a better word for it. There's grace.
Grace that is shown to you by others also, that you may experience something totally unexpected that lifts your spirit in such a way.
That's right. That's right. And nobody can take the memories away.
Exactly.
So.
They're all there. They will continue to be there. Geraldine, you write about Tony's fairly heavy drinking, something that the doctor had mentioned to him.
Well, Tony actually sought out help. He knew it was getting out of control and it was not healthy and that it had to stop. So it was very much on his mind. And it, you know, we'd always enjoyed wine at the end of the day, and in those gatherings with friends, you know, the bottles would be quite a few to be carried out the next day, but it was always just a pleasant social thing. And then during his last book, I think the stress of it, because it was a book that he was on a very tight time frame to deliver, and usually you hand in a book and there's a bit of an interregnum before all the editing and the corrections and the fact checking and then the publicity. But with this book, it was just boom, 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 and there was no break. And
why was that?
Oh, you know, various reasons to do with what was going on in the country and the book's relevance to it, and other exigencies about what other books might be coming out. Anyway, I think the pressure of his perfectionism with his work made him drive himself. So in the daytime, he would drink too much coffee, and he would nibble on this thing called Provigil, which is something that they invented for fighter pilots to make them hyper-focused.
Yes.
And then at the end of the day, he'd have to knock all that down with too much wine. And so, yes, in retrospect, I should have been much more of a nagging wife. I should have been a harridan. I should have, you know, said that's enough. But I just felt like we could deal with it after the book. You know, we'll deal with this after the book. We'll go off to a spa, we'll hike, we'll start doing yoga, and we'll get healthier habits. But that was not to be.
The doctor urged him to cut back on.
You know, no, Tony went to the doctor and said, you know, what is the best way? How can I how can I get a grip on that? And so he was getting advice
Ah,
and
I see.
and working towards it. He recognized that it couldn't go on, and it was not a healthy amount of consumption. And so he was working on it. And then after the book tour, we were really going to work on it.
I'm wondering how the grief has changed for you in the years since his death.
It hasn't changed, and it has changed. It's my dear friend Michael Lewis, who is a great friend of both Tony and I, also has had a shocking loss in his life. His beautiful 19-year-old daughter, my goddaughter, was killed tragically in a car accident. And he talks about, you don't have to go looking for the grief. It finds you. It comes when you're least expecting it. And the best thing to do is your work and to live your life. And that shark fin is going to be there in the water circling you for the rest of your life. But you have a life, and you have to embrace it with gratitude.
So the grief can come in moments when you're experiencing what you feel as joy.
Yeah,
and
I think that's when you want to turn to Tony and share a laugh, or tell him something funny or something that would interest him. Particularly in this fraught political time, we're both political animals, and I know he would have had a lot to say and a lot to write about what's going on now. And I miss him as a sounding board on these things.
Geraldine, my husband died in 2014, and there is not a minute that goes by where I don't think, I wonder what John Rehm would have said, or
Yeah.
I really wish he could have seen the glorious cathedral in Paris, or
Exactly.
it's those moments of inner thought that you can't escape. I mean, it's just always there.
I get sideswiped by the ridiculousness of him not being here. It's
The
just outrageous.
ridiculousness.
The outrageousness that he's not here, which is not a rational thought, but it's one that I have quite frequently.
Did you have actually written that you would have loved to live in Australia, but he did not want that.
The sacrifice of my marriage. He made a lot of sacrifices in our early life to accommodate my career, but the big decision that I made in marrying him was to have an American life and raise American kids, because his work was enmeshed in American history. It was what he cared about. It was what he did so well, which is look at the echoes of the American historical past and how they're still playing out in the present. He was had great insights into the unfinished business of American history and the divisions that caused the Civil War, and still in so many ways are being played out in our current politics. The divisions have changed between being a geographical north-south divide. Now it's more urban, rural, have and have-nots. But the fracture lines are there, and that is what fascinated him. And to do that work, he had to be in America. So I accepted that.
I wonder whether in your own writing, I know you're working on a new novel, at least I've heard tale of that, but
Yes,
I wonder in your own writing whether there is any temptation to write about politics and what's happening in this world.
it's funny you should mention it. I'm actually writing about something adjacent to that right now, but I can't speak about it.
I understand. I'm glad. I'm glad to know that. Are you also working on a book of fiction for those of us who love your fiction?
I spent an absolutely wonderful term at Oxford last fall. I was lucky enough to be a visiting. Hello. We have a lot of
A
things.
little spider, not so little. What kind of spider is that? Do you recognize it?
I hope not a lethal one.
I certainly hope not.
Anyway, I was at New College at Oxford, and I love to say New College because it was new in the 14th century. And I had a wonderful time dressed up as Professor McGonagall in my master's robe, swishing into this wonderful medieval hall every night for dinner with lovely students and academics. And I'm writing a book with an Oxford connection. Novel,
Wonderful.
historical.
Is there a page that you would like to read for us?
Gosh, let's see.
I have a number of pages marked.
Why don't you pick one for me?
All right. Look on page 40, starting with this morning, and see if that's a place you'd like to read to the end of page 41.
This morning, I started to do the work that I have come here to do. I opened my laptop and dragged the cursor back through my sent emails to the dreadful date, May 27, 2019. All the normal stuff. And then the email I sent to Sally in Georgetown. Header. Terrible news. Tony died. The hospital just called. Apparently a massive heart attack. I will be in touch when I know more. I keep reading. How quickly the ripples of loss widened. How swift the first broken-hearted reactions of friends. From Frankie. There is so much I want to say to you, but for now, just this. I will always think of Tony as I saw him last, golden and electric, backlit by the sunset at Lambert's Cove. I read this and I want to stop, but I make myself keep going, accepting the tightness in my chest, the radiating pain from my gut. And as I read on, I see how quickly I fell into what would become my rote response to condolences. We were so lucky. There it was, my defensive shield already deployed, and Tony not 3 hours dead. I have vaulted right over denial, anger, bargaining, and depression, and landed in the soft sands of acceptance. I now know that even as I wrote these words, I was in denial. I didn't believe he was dead. I expected him to come bursting through the door, throwing clothes out of his bag, loudly regaling me with funny tales from the road. That vault I had attempted was impossible. Those sands were quicksand.
Having read this book several times, I wonder how you feel having completed this book.
This book did what I needed it to do for me. I did this instead of hiring a therapist, and I feel much more mentally well now as a result of having taken all those feelings out of the basement of my heart and put them in a book. And now I can put it on the shelf, and they're safer out than in. I think a friend of mine once said, if you don't deal with your trauma, it goes down in the basement and starts lifting weights. So my advice to everybody is to tell your story, no matter how you do it. Tell it to friends, tell it to a therapist, write it down, but tell it.
Does anyone ever say to you, well, Geraldine, it was back in those days. He's been gone for a number of years now. You have to get over it.
I don't think they dare, Diane, because I'd smack them upside the head.
I understand totally.
There's no over it. There's no over it. You let it walk beside you. And I'm looking out here, and I don't know if it will show up on the Zoom, but there's the most incredible rainbow.
Oh, I can see it. Oh, how beautiful, Geraldine.
It's a double rainbow, and I think it's Tony smiling at us, Diane, because he loved you, and we were both so grateful to what you did for us in our writing career.
Well, I am so happy that I was able to interview both you and Tony. How great it was. And here we sit today, all these years later. This is going to be the very last interview I do for WAMU and public radio. And there you are in Australia, healing, healing, healing. A process that will continue to go on.
And as will you in your next endeavors. And it's been a mighty career of over half a century of brilliant broadcasting. And
thank you. Thank you.
Always an honor to be with you.
I will hope to move on to Substack and continue to be with wonderful writers like yourself. And therefore, I know we will see each other again.
We certainly will.
Geraldine, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you for having me.
So now a final word to all of you who've been so wonderful as listeners, loyal listeners, and attendees at these book clubs. When we began during the outbreak of COVID, we never really thought it would last 5 years. But now, after 52 years at WAMU, I have decided to move on. I will continue, however, with book discussions, with author interviews, with talk of news that is happening on Substack. So for the many of you who've stayed with us for these 5 years, the next time you see me, I will be on Substack, and I hope you will join me. I want to say a word of deep gratitude to 2 people, Allison Brody, Kennedy Wright, and a third, Berendra Silva, for helping to make these book clubs possible. Without them, they wouldn't have happened. Allison will stay at WAMU, and if you have any thoughts, ideas, or comments you'd like to make, you can send them to her at brody@WAMU, and that is .org, brody@WAMU.org. So until the next time we see each other, and I hope it will happen soon, I want to thank you again for all you've done to be such loyal listeners, viewers, and wonderful readers. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.